Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Brockhampton record, The Family. The Family is the latest studio album from hip-hop boy band Brockhampton, a group that are semi-critical darlings and definitely heavy hitters within the realm of mainstream audiences overall, and more importantly, this was slated to be the group's final album, and now, mind you, that was sort of the 1000th time that Brockhampton were either breaking up or on the verge or threat of breaking up, but let me just fill you in on a bit of Brockhampton lore here if you aren't a super fan and you aren't familiar with the entire history of the group within recent months and years at that. So this record was announced. It was announced at what was meant to be the very final Brockhampton show. It was the final Brockhampton album. And I mean, hey, say what you want about a lot of their albums. Sure, their last couple of records especially haven't gotten the hype that the first three Saturation albums did, but at the same time, there was weight behind that. I mean, sure, like I said, this is like the several time that Brockhampton have actually threatened to break up, but this one actually kind of felt final with tensions in the band rising over time, and again, it just put some weight behind the record, and it was definitely something that a lot of people, including myself, were excited for until the day before proper release when they said, hey, we're going to give you this album a day early because we actually have another album coming out the day afterwards called TM, and that of course kind of took away any emotional heaviness initially, at least away from the family. This was no longer the final Brockhampton album, and now all we have left is something weird. It's hard to describe this album at first glance in a manner that isn't just weird, strange, unpredictable, shocking even, because theoretically what was originally announced to be the last Brockhampton album isn't even a Brockhampton album. That's right, this record is primarily the most well-known, arguably, member of Brockhampton, Kevin Abstract, solo, with no other members of the group actually performing on this record. It's entirely him, performed by him, written by him, etc., etc. This is automatically a bad Brockhampton album because it's not even a Brockhampton album in general. It's a Kevin Abstract solo album with the group's name plastered onto it, though there are some things connecting it to the lore of the band that I will get into in a moment, but at first glance, it is definitely surreal to see an album that is quite literally a single member of Brockhampton being called Brockhampton. And if it didn't seem bad enough that what was originally supposedly intended to be the final Brockhampton album that was announced at a proper Brockhampton concert wasn't even a full band project, there are also several times on this record itself where Kevin Abstract openly admits that this album was made exclusively to fulfill contractual obligations and not for any reasons regarding passion, desire to push forward creatively, anything that, normally makes a good album. And all in all, this just kind of seemed like a major recipe for the most major disaster in Brockhampton's discography thus far, but also one of the worst albums of the year. This is just about as not promising as it gets. All of that set aside, though, I think the most surreal, shocking, unexpected thing about this entire record, considering all of that information that I just gave you, this is actually good. Kevin's performance work on here is strong, of course, his flow is great as always, but what's really to take note of here is actually his lyricism, and this record, although, like I said before, made for the sole purpose of contractual obligations, does reflect on the history of Brockhampton, thus connecting it to, again, the background and history and the lore of the group itself. In that manner, it is a Brockhampton album, I suppose, but really, that is the most interesting thing about this record, because while it does feel predictably therapeutic for Kevin, considering this was all written solely by him for the most part, as far as I'm aware, I don't think anyone would have expected The Family to be as emotionally raw as it ultimately is. Topics addressed throughout this record in a fairly straightforward and blunt manner include toxic relationships, regrets regarding interactions with loved ones in the past, and the awkwardness and uncomfortableness that can come with being placed in the spotlight in front of a large fan base, especially when you have a number of other personal problems that you are expected to look past for the sake of being a performer and entertainer. And although this all could have easily come across as a sort of oh pity me kind of record, it really doesn't. This is the kind of emotional, brutal honesty that I wouldn't necessarily expect from Kevin Abstract, I wouldn't expect from a Brockhampton project, and honestly, I just wouldn't expect from an album like this in general. There are actually a number of spoken word passages that are primarily utilized to open up and close off several different tracks throughout this record that are, again, just from Kevin Abstract being emotionally open and honest about all of those topics and beyond. And it's unexpected, but it's absolutely welcome. And although this isn't a Brockhampton album per se, and you could argue that this is, again, just a Kevin Abstract solo album with the band's name slapped on it, it does have a nice ring for a send-off to the band if this was actually their last album like it was announced to be. Now, although I am surprised by how much I ultimately ended up enjoying and even respecting what this record does, it's still a flawed album, and it's far from even great. It has a lot of issues with it, primarily the fact that a lot of the tracks here, and in fact most of them actually, are under 2.5 minutes, and that leaves a lot of songs here feeling underdeveloped, undercooked, and well executed, but generally underdone. The primary essential here, the major highlight, is the album closing track, also titled Brockhampton, and that's by far the longest song on this album, extending to a whole whopping 4-ish minutes, and yeah, that kind of tells you enough about the length that these songs go here in terms of general depth in composition, and they are all well produced, they are all well written for the most part at least, but at the same time it just kind of feels like every track ends before it actually begins, and just delivers a song with a massive amount of potential that only uses about, say, a quarter of it. The family also bounces around between a variety of different sonic aesthetics and styles, and while it is interesting, it's also not the most consistent and effective thing in the world. I mean, one second you're listening to these sort of chipmunk soul instrumentals with slightly jazzy beats, and the next second you've got something that's almost bordering on so aggressive that it could be a light version of industrial hip-hop with some flirting with avant-garde touches here or there throughout the record, and again, all of these are interesting in their own right. They're interesting to hear Kevin Abstract perform, but at the same time, they're not all effective, and ultimately, it does feel like the family doesn't necessarily have the most straightforward and confident and consistent creative direction, mainly focusing on the thematic concept of the record, and that is respectable, because the thematic concept of this record, the history of Brockhampton being told from the perspective of Kevin Abstract, is beautifully executed, flawlessly executed even, but the actual sonic qualities, they still do shine through here with their flaws because of the lack of focus on them. So overall, The Family is not the best album in the world or anything like that. It's not even the best Brockhampton album, if I'm being totally honest. It's not even the best Brockhampton album to come out within the last 10 years. It's just not a great record overall, but at the same time, I really do genuinely enjoy this in a way, and that's primarily because it's Kevin Abstract coming out on stage by himself and openly discussing from his perspective what happened to Brockhampton. Why did things fall apart? Why did things not last longer than they seemingly were meant to? And yeah, sure, you could argue that this is not technically a Brockhampton album, and for some it will surely be an unsatisfactory closer due to not having more than one member of Brockhampton on it. But at the same time, if you're looking at this album solely as a piece of closure for the whole entire Brockhampton project, the Brockhampton brand, I actually think it does the job pretty effectively. And sure, it would have been nice to at least have a couple of features from the other members of the group here, but at the same time, if it's just going to be Kevin Abstract telling the story of how this band took a rise and inevitably a fall, I mean, this is as good as it gets. Despite a lot of undercooked tracks and maybe some failure to actually have creative direction overall, I really do think that this is an effective album, and it's an enjoyable one that's easy to revisit as well, and maybe it's not necessarily made for anyone who isn't really familiarized with Brockhampton. You could even go as far as to say that this is a record solely tailored to the diehards out there, but for an album that is just one member of Brockhampton talking very personally about his personal life in the band that he was a part of, doing a record that he openly admits multiple times throughout this album that this is just a contractual obligation that he's filling out so Brockhampton can break up in peace, this is just really an excellent release. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.